Good evening, everybody. I am Abe with Mystic Jen Mara, a small town mystic in the middle of Idaho. And tonight I am going to be starting a new series. I mentioned it in December, but I'm going to probably do this on the first and third Mondays, depending on how busy I get. Anyway, I might do a little bit more, just depends on, like I said, how busy I get. And it has a unique title, which is Occult and Crochet. Well, there's a reason for that. I figured I would introduce you to some of the more interesting characters in occult history, and including some religious figures as well. I'm not leaving anything out because occult really just means secret, and some of the foundations of some of our modern day religions were formed in secret, so it all kind of fits. And I really enjoy crocheting. If you've checked my website out, it's a whole pile of it on there, and I figured why not work on a new project or whatever I've got sitting around while we discuss these other individuals. So if that's something that sounds fun to you, I may not do the crochet every single night just because of time, lighting, how tired my hands are, how in-depth the conversation will get, because there's some of these characters that I have got in my queue here that get a little interesting, to say the least. And I may end up getting distracted by trying to read off everything that I stop doing the crochet part altogether, because that does happen. And right now, I'm going to count my number. I'm a horrible counter. I can't count in my head, so I will be 1 second. Okay, sorry, starting a dishcloth, and it is this really soft white cotton yarn that's got some really cool blues and greens and hints of yellow in it, because everything on my website is actually handmade by me, so there's a little bit of that in there as well. The other thing that I was going to mention, and this is just something that I've noticed and I thought about after I'd done all of December. If you want to donate to the stream or to support the channel, and I'm not saying yes or no, just saying it's out there. I'm not monetized on YouTube yet, but there is a link in the YouTube description for Streamlabs, and there's a way to donate through that. And there's also with Odyssey, they have that platform set up completely different than YouTube, which is super awesome in that respect. But again, not a big deal, just making a comment because it's something that I've noticed other streamers do, and I want to head that direction one of these days to become something, I don't know, be fun just to be able to bring educational stuff to you guys, and see how the community grows and see what happens with that, because there's a lot of fun information out there. And for example, okay, I had to make sure I had certain things queued up tonight. The number one character we are going to speak of this evening, and I may not be able to do this because I'm still new enough to the streaming thing that I'm nervous all of a sudden. That's crazy. But the first person that we're going to discuss in this new series, I'll set that aside for a minute, is Andrew Jackson Davis. And there's a little picture. I think this is the right one. There we go. He was an American spiritualist born in August of 1826 in upstate New York to his simple, uneducated mother and his unfortunately drunken father. The history that I've been researching about him is interesting, to say the least, but his father figure was not the greatest thing in the world. They didn't say much about his parents, which is not that surprising. The history in this time period wasn't that great. I'll take him down. His parents really weren't the greatest of people. Andrew had minimal education to start with because his family was extremely poor. He was very curious about life, though, and this made made him very susceptible to some of the things that occurred in his life. He was an apprentice as a shoemaker. His father started there, and his father was a tinker. He did a few other things too. And as he got older, and the dates are really weird, it was somewhere between the ages of 13 and 16, he apprenticed under a different shoemaker and was actually doing fairly well for being, illiterate. You don't need to read to be able to make shoes, basically. But he did not find any form of joy in this, so he left after about 2 years. I can understand that in some ways. In 1843, he first learned about the concept of animal magnetism. And we will be discussing that at a later time as well, just as a little teaser. Strangely, though, this was a turning point for this young man. After his first introduction to the term magnetism, he came to believe that he was possessed of clairvoyant powers, at one point saying he was extremely powerful clairvoyantly. And this named him to call himself the Poughkeepsie Seer. And I actually looked that up, so I'm saying it correctly. Although when you look at how it's actually spelled out, it's not how it sounds in the slightest. Legend holds that after the lecture of one Andrew attended on mesmerism, which is animal magnetism, he had a trance encounter with a dead physician or philosopher, Galen, or the metaphysician Emanuel Swedenborg. Now, we will be discussing him later as well, because he's an interesting character in history. He claimed this occurrence happened over 40 miles from his home. He also states that he traveled that distance in a single night on foot, either through trance walking or, and the stories are weird about this and they're both attributed to him, so who knows if he changed his story. He either did a trance walking, which allows you to walk extremely fast over exceptionally long distances, or he was levitating. Your guess is as good as mine. This happened over 100 years ago. He claimed this led to his mental illumination and awakening to his psychic powers. Over the next 3 years or so, he practiced magnetic healing based off of the teachings of Franz Mesmer. There, we'll get into him too. Andrew wrote his first book. In a trance state in 1847. He dictated the entire book to his scribe, who was Reverend William Fishbow. And I dug a little bit into him because I might use him later. I didn't find much, so who knows? The book was the book was titled "The Principles of Nature: Her Divine Revelations and a Voice to Mankind." So it's a 3-in-1 book. This was his first of his writings, and it took about 15 months to dictate the book alone. 15 months to write this thing. Many people came in at various points to witness his trance states and his dictations, which is very similar in a lot of ways to how Edgar Cayce would receive a lot of his information. And over his lifetime, Andrew was an extremely prolific writer, penning around 30 books over the course of his life. I linked The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind in digital and physical book below. And I will say the physical book, I was looking at it because I was like, ooh, this guy sounds interesting. I wonder what he wrote. It's like 800 and some odd pages long. It is a massive work, which is pretty impressive when you realize that he was only in his 20s, like 21, I believe. Where was he at here? Yeah, he was like 21 when he wrote this book, and he had minimal education. And I mean, it's impressive just on the fact of that. I mean, that book's going to be that thick. And in that time, those books would take, several days to print properly. Excuse me. Too many late nights after the New Year's. But it was pretty interesting to look into it because the book itself is huge. And I figured, if you wanted to look into what how he kind of got his start. You can check that out. After Andrew wrote his first book, he decided to go out on a speaking and teaching tour, which didn't do so well. That's when he went back to his writings. There was people who tried to claim he was a fraud and things like that, so it was a little bit sketchy. I mean, this stuff was really new, because you have to remember, during the 40s, 1840s, this is when Millerism was starting up. They weren't impressed with that. This was when Joseph Smith was starting up. This is when the Fox sisters were starting up. And so what he was doing was extremely countercultural for the time, and he just didn't have the, whatever it is, the spark, you could say, that attracted people like it did for the Fox sisters. Sorry. It was during this time that he met the woman who would become his future wife in 1848. So this was around the middle and towards the end of his first, speaking healing tour. And she assisted, how they met anyway, was assisted in funding his work. This woman was Mrs. Catherine Dodge Needawolf. Very weird name. A wealthy heiress that was 20 years Andrew's senior. And I can't confirm, but it appears there was a little hanky-panky going on, and that she might have still been married while they were having their little affair. So donating the money at that time may have been more of hush money, if we're going to go there. But there was a little bit of relationship, because they did eventually get married after she was, divorced. And so what went on there was a little weird, a little sus to me, but that's, my opinion. It was a short marriage, though, as I said, because being the fact that she was 20 years older than him, she actually passed away in 1853. They'd only been married for around 4 or 5 years-ish. And this was the first of 3 marriages for our dear young Andrew. But this was the only one that tied directly to his spiritual life, and so I'll probably only mention the others in passing. He had a marriage and a divorce from Mary Fenn Robinson, and his last marriage, which is who he passed away when he was still married to, was Delphine Della Elizabeth Markham, and she outlived him and died in 1928. So that's pretty much the size of his marital life. Very turbulent, to say the least. Sorry, I am, like I said, too many late nights. One of the names that I ran across during this time, and it was just an interesting name, and I was like, wait, who's this? Was Dr. George Bush. It stopped me dead in my tracks, actually, when I first read the name. But he was from the University of New York's Hebrews Studies Department. How annoying. Dr. Bush sang Andrew's praises as a great man who had answered great scientific and philosophical beliefs, among other subjects. But later, Dr. Bush would decry him as being filled with a false or an evil spirit. Dr. Bush was actually involved in some of the original trance dictation for Andrew's first book, and that was when he would go on to praise him. And then after the book came out, Dr. Bush would go through it, and then he found reasons to hate it, and he didn't find just one reason, he found several, is what he claimed, and went off about how that Andrew was being misled by a false and treacherous spirit. Personally, I feel like there may have been some negative reaction from religious leaders at the time, and Dr. George Bush did not want to lose some of his patrons, so he started to speak about Andrew. During that time, though, what I found interesting in researching this young man is Andrew's ideas on creation. It is a burning and fiery event. was making me think of the legends of the jinn, not the genies, the good genies like the jinn, the fire spirits from the Middle East, and how they are born from fire in the time before existence. So from the little excerpts that I found, because like I said, I want to actually read the whole book too, he really does describe the creation of the world and of the universe through a fiery explosion. He also talks about how everything, and this fascinates me because there's been other people who've had this idea ever since, including the law of one, and quantum physics is starting to look into this type of a concept. Mind you, quantum physics wasn't even a thought in the 1950s. But he describes how everything sprang from one single particle, the essence of all coming from the one infinite, and there we will return. So basically we explode out and compress back in. This was in his first book, and it's the one, like I said, I really want to read. Although the reviews of it were interesting. It's written in a difficult language. No, it's written in Old English, which was not something that took to our modern day collection of words. But it's also over 800 pages long, so there's a lot going on there. Andrew also predicted, and this is interesting to me because the outer planets weren't even known during this time period. He also predicted there were 9 planets in our solar system. And that we rotated around our central solar sun. But what also was interesting, and the concept of the Milky Way galaxy wasn't well known or wasn't even a thought in the way we use it today during this time period, but he describes how our little solar system here rotates around the central sun, is what he would call it. What we would now reference as the heart of the Milky Way galaxy, which is supposed to be a gigantic black hole. He describes it, from what the little excerpts I found, in an amazing detail, that we are on an arm of a spiral around this central sun, which is what we really are. Just central sun is black hole. So that's impressive on its face value, if nothing else. He also claimed that there was life on planets from Mercury to Saturn. There was no life on the outer 3 planets, though: Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. What's interesting was his belief in the evolution of humanity was associated and tied to the life on these different planets. Mercury and Venus are basically, if to use phrases from the law of one, first and second. First density was Mercury, second density is Venus. We're on the 3rd planet, so we're in the 3rd density. But as we evolve spiritually and physically, we bounce to the next planets out. And so I just thought that was an interesting way of him looking at it, is that from the center of the sun is the birth of life. Mercury is the first concept of creation. Venus is the second concept of creation. We're sitting on the 3rd planet, so we're in the 3rd concept of creation. I just also thought it was interesting that he ended the life cycles on Saturn, which is also in alchemy the beginning and the end of all work. And so there's a little bit of this whole, like, it's a cycle thing, which I thought was pretty fascinating. But that's how I view life. I look at things that are a little different like that. And in 1855, Andrew's views and beliefs were attacked by a theologian by the name of Asa Mahan. And we'll go with Asa because that sounds closer to me. I don't know. Asa wrote a treatise on how Andrew was basically a fraud, and thought to expose him in her writings, which didn't actually expose him as anything. Another writer of that time, Joseph McCabe, attacked the young Arthur's vision of science, Mr. McCabe believed that Andrew had misunderstood, therefore misrepresented, what basic science he had actually read in his very limited education. McCabe was of the opinion that nothing was channeled, but it was translated from memory in an exceptionally messy way. Except for what I have read so far, it had nothing to do with the science of the time. It was beyond that science. These guys did not like the fact, just like Galileo, when the Earth's not flat, was hated for his opinion. That's kind of how it feels that this kid was getting attacked. Not by this point, he was like in his 30s, so he's not a kid anymore. But other physicians attacked his scientific theories as well. For example, Andrew's lack of knowledge of basic chemistry was evident in his writings. He apparently didn't understand the basic concept of water, which, H2O, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. Didn't get that. But he also didn't have that type of an education either. The common person of that day probably didn't know what that was either. But after the chaos of his younger life, Andrew eventually, and this is, he was in his 40s, I think, late 40s, he owned a small bookshop in Boston. He went to school, and this is just during the quiet times of his life. He was still writing, and he was still doing his animal magnetism healings, but it was quietly done. After he had a really explosive young life, he kind of toned it down towards the end, and part of it was his second wife was really I don't know if you want to call it a stabilizing influence or a quieting influence on him. But as he went on, he did eventually learn and go and earn a degree in natural medicine. Herbal remedies became his interest from what I've seen, so people would come to him for, energetic healing or for herbal healing, which he didn't do surgery that I found anywhere, but he did have a fairly, decent business. Andrew was influenced, and I don't know how strongly I want to put this because, again, his reading skills were not the greatest, but he was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, who was, from Sweden, or Switzerland. I'll have to look that up again. And the philosophy of the shakers, which is where the divine comes in, and you'll know when you're connected in because you're shaking like someone's hitting you with an electric rod. There were those who believed that he plagiarized Emanuel Swedenborg's work, although now that we're, modern times and we can look back because it's a little bit clearer sometimes, that's in doubt. Swedenborg's work was just starting to make its way to the United States during the time Andrew was writing his work. Being poor and illiterate for all intents and purposes, how would you have read or even gotten your hands on an extremely rare book during that time? And Swedenborg was writing in a different language, so translating it was even more difficult. That's where the doubts start to come in about where he got his ideas. There's no evidence that I have found, and I dug around for several days trying to find some connection between Swedenborg's work and Andrew Jackson Davis, and I found nothing. Now, if there is something out there and you've seen it or you know about it, let me know, because that would be awesome, just to be able to make that connection. Andrew's original works are currently housed in, of all places, the Edgar Cayce Library, since he also used trance states similar to Edward Cayce's to gain his knowledge, which I thought was pretty interesting just in general. Andrew Jackson Davis is also known as, we'll bring this picture up just so you can see him at this point, the John the Baptist of the spiritual movement, since he was a crier in the night at the very beginning of the movement for energetic healing and mysticism. It is said that he wrote in a journal around the end of March of 1848. Make him go away. No. Go away, everybody there. That he had a vision that told him there was a living demonstration being born in that moment and that the good work had begun. Oddly enough, The Fox sisters had their very first encounter with the wrappings in the same year on the 31st of March in 1848. So his Crier in the Night was pretty much his biggest claim to fame, as he was one of the ones out there telling people about things were changing, things were coming in, things were happening, from a very uneducated person in a very young part of his life. So really, his writing and his one primary book, and the fact that he kind of announced that the Fox sisters were there before he even knew who they were, but he started talking about these people are coming, this change is occurring, this movement is happening now, we need to be looking out for these people. And he did, from what I can find, he did actually encounter the Fox sisters on several occasions and had nothing negative to say, because he felt that what they were doing was helping us step into the next level of human consciousness. So, what do you think? I skipped his non-spiritual life. Like I said, he went to medical school. He met his, I think that was when he met his second wife. They got married, got divorced. He met his third and final wife, who, like I said, outlived him. And really, that was pretty much it. He had his little bookstore and his medical practice, and he did his energy work through that, and he did, herbal stuff through there. And he went to medical school to become the doctor using medicine and herbs, but he tied it in a way that I thought was interesting to mesmerism, his practice. And it wasn't like a consistent thing, but he would do like a session on somebody, and then he would prescribe the herbal remedies based on the session. So he was literally combining the two. And I did not find in any research, 3 marriages, even though one of them was significantly older, you'd have thought that there might pop a child somewhere through there, and I found nothing, which to me was a little bit strange, just because you were married 3 times. But if you've heard of a lineage that came from his bloodline with kids, like I said, I'm willing to continue to grow with what I'm doing here. I'm doing kind of short biographies, just because I'm not sure how deep I want to go into each person's life. Like Andrew Jackson Davis, though, there wasn't a lot that I could find. You either had a spiritual life or his medical career. There was really not a crossover, and so I'm tailoring my stuff towards the spiritual. And that's where our focus was. So I linked some of his work in his description. Like I said, I haven't read these yet, but they look fascinating, especially considering the time. The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelation, and A Voice to Mankind is his first work, and it's the biggest one. Like I said, it's 800 pages, and they have a Kindle version, and then there's also a paperback. And then he did a book on the harmonial philosophy, which is basically on the harmonies of the body and how to adjust them through his mesmerism practices. And then he did an autobiography on himself, which is kind of cool. And it tells the story in an expanded form, because of course they're not going to give it out there for free, of his awakening when he met Galen and Emanuel Swedenborg. Is that who it was? Yeah, he actually talks in this book about and the book's called The Magical Staff, about his meeting of Emanuel Swedenborg and Galen in the astral, basically, and how he traveled this distance. And it's, about 145 pages or something like that. It's not super long, but those are the 3 primary books that I thought would be kind of the most interesting, just based on what I could find of his life. He wrote some other smaller treatises about animal magnetism, which is cool in itself, but to me that wasn't the key of what his life was. The first book, like I said, the big one, just because he literally wrote 3 different books and put them into one form, and it is covering such a broad range of practices and beliefs, because he goes over how nature works. And that's where he gets into the planets and the 9 of them, not 7 that they believed at the time. Yeah. And then Her Divine Revelations is basically a description of nature and how it can teach us and help us heal. And then The Voice to Mankind is from what I can gather, kind of how he spreads the message and how we can spread the message and how we can work with this knowledge. As I said, I haven't read them yet, but I've looked at some quotes and I've checked out some little excerpts that I could find. And I will say, and I said this before, the writing style, because it's written in an Old English style, and they pretty much wrote what he said in trance, so it's a little, can be a little disconnected in the sentence phrasing. So it's a little difficult to read, I will say that right up front. And in a lot of cases, the information is a past knowledge for us in our modern world. But during the time he wrote it, it was actually applicable to their future. I mean, like I said, it was 150 some odd years ago. So there's some interesting history for us, but would have been prophecy for them. And that's the thing when you read a lot of these older works. You have to understand when they were writing them, the stuff that we know now didn't even exist. So that's kind of how I'm going to look at the lens of this book when I get my hands on it. And like I said, they're in there for historical reference. If you guys are interested, you can check those out. We'll move this out of the way because I don't need it now. But what do you guys think? Do you think that he actually did a lot of this stuff? Do you think he was a fraud? Like I said, I tried to give a balanced impression. My biggest argument for him not being a fraud is he's describing things that they didn't even know about until, I believe, the late 1800s. So he's talking about stuff that hadn't even been technically discovered at that point. And then his theories on spiritual evolution, from Mercury being the lowest level of human awareness, Venus being the next, we're on Earth, the third planet, so we're at the third level, Mars will be the next, all the way out to Saturn. So there's some interesting theories and thoughts there if you are looking to check those out. Other than that, let's see, it's probably cut this one off here now. I'm not sure if I'm going to be live tomorrow. I'm trying to figure out a good schedule. I know Mondays I'll be doing this. It'll probably be the first and third Mondays for now, and then I'll stick something else on the other Mondays. And then I'm thinking I might do Tuesday and Thursday. I haven't quite decided yet. Like I said, I'm trying to figure out a new balance in life. So, and on that note, if you enjoyed this type of stream, like the video, please. And if you are enjoying this type of content, and there's quite a bit out there now, you can subscribe and be notified whenever I go live. And like I said, if you have any thoughts, opinions, comments, drop them in the comment section below. I do read those because I enjoy hearing the feedback and knowing kind of what direction to go with things. So I will let this go for now, and I will talk to you guys in a future video, and have a great evening.